I don't know if any of you remember that old Donovan song called Atlantis. It goes something like this. Way down in all the oceans, where I wanna be, she may be. Way down in all the oceans, where I wanna be, she may be. Well, not many people know where the origin of Atlantis comes from. And it's actually talked about by Plato. I think it's in the Timaeus and the Critias. Yet the absolute origin of it comes from Solon. Solon was, I think even before Heraclitus, Solon was the Greek lawgiver. And he is kind of like a Moses or a Jesus figure. He came to bring a new dispensation of the laws. And the previous person before him, like say the Moses of Jesus, of Solon, it was Draco. Draco's laws had been perverted. And the rich were living at the expense of the poor in this time. And so Solon was kind of like a prophet sent to free the people of the Greeks. I think it was around about 600 BC. There were a lot of prophets sent at this time, around about the same time. Yeah, Zoroaster or Zarathustra and the Buddha who both came around about 500 years before Christ. Anyway, Solon was a prophet, and as a prophet he had to create masterworks. He was also a poet, and so his poetry, the people who think they know about poetry, they disparage his poetry. But his poetry was very great indeed, because this was real poetry. Real poetry is really where the law comes from. The law of nature is dispensed through poetry. It comes in rhyme. You can't have poetry that doesn't rhyme. It's just an oxymoron, really. Anyway, we digress a little. So, Solon, after he also wrote a constitution, so he was a bit like that fellow from the French Revolution, who also was sent to create new laws for the people and a new constitution for France, which was never implemented. Justin Martyr was his name. You might like to read up about Justin Martyr. He's a similar kind of a character. And so Solon brought a new constitution, set a true democratic basis, and replaced the oligarchy with a true democracy. And after he'd done this, because he is a master on the journey to mastering the law, as a master of law, what you have to do is you have to do masterworks, and then this is accompanied by a great journey also. And so Solon, after he produced his masterwork, he handed over the laws to the people of Athens, the Greeks, and off he went to Egypt to do pilgrimage to the holy sites of Egypt. And so when in Egypt, apparently he spent many years in Egypt, and he was welcomed into the temple, being a true high priest, if you like, of the Greeks. He got on very well with the high priest of the Egyptians, and they took him into the temple and they explained to him his true history, which the Greeks had lost. The Greeks didn't know their own history, because what happens in the great cycles of the world is that there's an alternating destruction of the world, first by water and then by fire, then water, then fire, over great eons of time. And the Greeks' civilization had been destroyed in a cataclysm of fire that took out Atlantis. as well. The people of Atlantis was an island in the Atlantic Sea between the Americas, or in the same area as the Americas, and on that part of the world, the western side of the world. And the Egyptians said to Solon, he said, look, you guys, the rest of the world was destroyed in these cataclysms or apocalypses, but Egypt, because of its unusual geography, was saved in this through these periods. It lived through these periods, so it carried its history. That's why the Egyptian civilization is so long and old and ancient, because it was never destroyed because of its peculiar geography, neither by fire or flood. Because there's a funny thing about the Nile, I don't personally understand it that well, but apparently when the Nile floods, when the great deluge comes, the flood of Deucalion, then instead of the waters of the Nile, like the Rhine, just washing down and washing everything away and destroying everything, somehow with the Nile, it comes up, it rises up from the sea. That's the opposite thing somehow. And so the Egyptian civilization was able to live and carry on through these periods. And so the whole world regarded the Egyptian civilization as the wisest and the greatest civilization, and people used to go there to learn from the Egyptians. And it's interesting, the Egyptians told Solon that the reason was because they had preserved their history for such a long period of time. And they wanted to tell Solon about the ancient Greeks before what we call the ancient Greeks, which is the time of Solon. Before that, he said that the ancient Greeks were a very great nation that saved the world from the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans were a civilization, an empire that had arisen in the Americas in the West, and it was wanted to place a hegemony on the whole of the rest of the European world. It wanted to create hegemony and take it over and enslave the world. And so the Greeks were the ones that fought Atlantis to a standstill, basically, and prevented the Atlanteans from taking over that part of the world, Egypt and Greece and so on. And so the Egyptians, who'd written this into the histories, knew about this because it was a big part of their history. And so they informed Solon about this, about Atlantis, and about how Atlantis and the Greeks were both destroyed by a geological event, earthquake, volcanic activity, and so on, which affected both Greece and Atlantis. And at this point, Atlantis sank beneath the sea. Okay, so this is about, I haven't done the exact arithmetic, but it's about 12,000 years ago, and these are the cycles of history are in 12,000. This 12,000 year cycle is very important because this is a cycle of the planetary activity and the comets and all that stuff all works on these cycles. And what's interesting is that there's some very ancient comets have come through recently in this time, and there's a very important comet, ancient comet, an asteroid, a comet is an asteroid that kind of like a miniature planet is actually coming quite soon, I think in April, and it's a very important comet also. And so the Greeks, having saved the world from the hegemony of the Western Atlanteans, were also destroyed, and their civilization had to restart again. And so the Egyptians were the ones who knew about this. And Solon was very happy to report this back and record this history. And Plato learned of it from Solon, and he reiterated the history. And I'm reiterating the history now in case people forget, because it's a little known fact. But because now we're in this cycle again, this 12,000 year cycle, and you can see there's a saying and the truth that as in the beginning, so in the end. And so if you think about last time, the cycle was hegemony coming from the West. We now have hegemony coming from the West again, and a corrupted culture in the same way as the Atlanteans were corrupted, and then the desire to take over and enslave the rest of the world. So it's a repeat, if you like, and we also have great nations rising up, other empires, to tackle and fight this fallen empire, to destroy all of it. And you can see that the Greeks destroyed themselves in the process of destroying the Atlanteans. And this may well be what happens again. We may find that the Western Hemisphere hegemony is then attacked and defeated by the other two empires, I suppose the Russian and the Chinese empires, those empires which stand in its path. And in the end, the Egyptians outlive it all. Who are the Egyptians? We don't know. But it's interesting that this is where the Jews and the Israelis come from, from Egypt. They were slaves of the Egyptians, and so they're living in this area, And so their history goes way back, and maybe this is why we know so much about the Jewish history, because they're also part of this place in the world which is saved from great cataclysms. I don't know. It's very interesting. One of the other interesting facts I found out recently too is that the religion of the Greeks is virtually identical to the Egyptians in many aspects, and they have an ancestral worship, if you like, of ancestors, of the great ancestors that brought the teachings, and they teach that God himself incarnates in these great ancestors to bring the teachings to humanity. And so they name these ancestors, and the Greeks have Zeus, which was their great lawgiver, if you like, Zeus, and he came after the Time Man. What was his name? He must have been the devil himself. I can't remember his name. Cronus, I think. Cronus, sort of where the word crony comes from. And so Cronus was the old fallen. He originally brought the great teachings, but then in the end, after 12,000 years, however long, all those teachings are all fallen, and the whole state of affairs of the nation is corrupt. And so a new god, if you like, comes to teach the people. This is Zeus in the Greek. And so the Egyptians have their Geb, or Jeb, G-E-B, and Nut, and this is followed by Osiris and Isis. And each of these gods has their equivalent goddesses, because they're like Adam and Eve, and Jesus and Mary. The Christianity has the same worship of the ancestors, the Moses, the Abrahams, the Jesuses, so on. And our great ancestor of this time is Krishnamurti. He was a great lawgiver, the teacher that God incarnated into personally to bring the new teaching, to save humanity from the native hegemony, the organizationalists who are corrupting life on earth as we know it. So I hope this short history overview of the big picture, where the ancient Greeks fit in, the Greeks that predate the ancient Greeks by thousands of years, who saved a planet once before at their own expense, a bit like Russia, And the Russians are the Greek Orthodox. If you think about it, they are the descendants of the Greek Orthodox. It's their church, And so the Chinese they're the descendants of Lao Tzu, the master, and the Buddha. People like this, their teachings, his teaching, the teachings of the other masters came encapsulated in the Chinese culture. Confucius, people like this, their lawgiver. So to see the bigger picture of history perhaps gives us a better understanding of the time that we live in. Okay. There's one thing, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it. I'm allowed to say it, and that is that there's an event going to happen on the 3rd of June. This is the first time I've ever been given an exact date. Watch your calendar on the 3rd of June. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen on the 3rd of June, but something important is going to happen on the 3rd of June this year, 2024. Thanks for watching.